Welcome to the third instalment of our Breaking Ground webinar series. Please note that this session is being recorded, but whilst you can see us, we can't see you. My name is Adele Evans and I'm a Principal Associate in our Construction Insurance team. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Matthews and Andrew McConnell, who both specialise in construction and engineering risks. Good morning, guys.
Morning.
Hi, Adele.
Today, we're going to be looking at some of the common exclusions that you can find in a construction professional indemnity policy. We're not going to go through all of the exclusions today, but just cover some of the main ones that do tend to crop up on policies for those in the construction industry. We'll then examine how these exclusions operate in a short case study at the end. So, first, I'm going to hand over to Aaron, who is going to talk about contractual liability exclusions. Aaron, what are we talking about when we say that construction PI policies generally will not cover pure contractual liability?
Yes, so in very simple terms, PI policies are not intended to provide cover for claims brought against an insured where that insured is engaged on what we might call onerous contractual terms. So by onerous contractual terms, what we mean is basically terms which impose a greater responsibility on an insured than the standard of reasonable skill and care at common law. So effectively, a policy isn't going to cover a pure contractual breach unless that contractual breach is also a negligent act or omission. So an example of a pure contractual breach might be if a contractor complies with the British standard, but there's an error in the standard, which means that the building is unsound, which is unlikely to be negligent.
So what types of clauses do we commonly see that are likely to be excluded on this basis?
Yeah, so I mean, the types of terms that we commonly see that wouldn't be covered often might include fitness for purpose obligations, although that being said, we are seeing increasingly these days extensions of cover for fitness for purpose obligations. So the terms of specific policies should always be considered. Other terms excluded might include, warranties, guarantees, basically most contractual assurances or promises. Collateral warranties, though, do tend to be exempt from that, although that is something that we're going to talk a little more about in one of our later sessions.
Okay, so essentially the key for triggering the policy indemnity is negligence, unless, of course, there's a fitness for purpose extension. Andrew, if I can come to you next to talk to us about pricing risk and why increased costs during a build may not be covered.
Thanks, Adele. Yeah, you can. Good morning, everyone. So in the context of contractors or any other parties contracting on a fixed price basis, a PI policy will not usually respond to risks associated with increased construction costs. So if a contractor agrees to enter into a tender and they provide a price and they subsequently realise that they're going to spend more on materials, for example, or the project is simply going to take longer than anticipated and the contractor can't recover those costs under the contract itself, that is not something that the contractor can normally recover from their PI insurers.
Okay, so basically the price that a contractor agrees with their employer for a tender is at their own risk.
Yeah, that's essentially right. So it's for the contractor to ensure that they build enough contingency into the contract. So, for example, a contractor might build pricing contingencies into the tender price, or they might ensure that more favourable contract terms are within the contract itself. However, if the costs are unanticipated and the result of negligence, so things like design, planning issues or delays, all of the things that we usually see in a negligence claim, they may be covered by the PI policy or recoverable from third parties for that matter. So the key thing here really, Adele, is to check the policy and the contract itself in terms of the first port of call.
Yes, again, the key for triggering the policy indemnity is negligence as well. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at the situation where an insured wants to bring a claim against another insured entity. Aaron, is this something that would generally be covered?
So no, insureds under the same professional indemnity policy can't generally claim against each other. It's pretty common provision in insurance policies generally. It's also a general principle of common law. But it's just something we highlight here because it's particularly relevant in the context of construction insurance, because it's a scenario which can so often arise. So, it is not uncommon for large construction companies to have various different branches that are all contracted to do different things on the same project. So a main contractor may have a subsidiary, they may have a sister company that's employed as a subcontractor for smaller parts. And so if that subcontractor then, for instance, negligently designs that part of the project, the main contractor is not going to be able to bring a claim against the subcontractor. That's not going to be covered under the policy. On a large construction project, it's not uncommon to see project insurance taken out, which covers several of the different parties involved. Again, though, named insureds can't generally claim against each other.
Okay, so moving on to retroactive dates. Andrew, issues arise here as well, don't they?
Yes, yeah, although it all sounds very straightforward, it's often not in practice, but PI policies essentially contain retroactive dates, which effectively exclude cover for any wrongful acts which occurred before a specific date. So these are sometimes in place to allow for when a company was previously uninsured, or they might merge with another business that had its own pre-existing insurance. So if a claim is made and it relates to something that happened before the retroactive date, it will not be covered by the PI policy. And crucially, this is not a question of when the claim is made, as one might expect, or necessarily when the loss is suffered, but instead it relates to when the act occurred.
And the time that an act occurred can sometimes be quite difficult to pinpoint, can't it?
Yeah, that's right. So that's essentially the tricky bit when it comes to retroactive dates. So particularly if there are ongoing responsibilities under a contract, which might not be finalised until practical completion is certified. So these may arise after the retroactive date, but the original act could still occur prior to the retroactive date. So you can see where the complications come in there. And ultimately, again, this is something to review from the very outset and undertake further investigations before confirming whether cover is to be confirmed.
Yes, absolutely. And the next exclusion that we're going to talk about is bodily injury. Aaron, this isn't as straightforward as it might initially seem, is it?
No. So, there's some examples up on the slides, firstly, of the wording of some common bodily injury exclusions. And the starting point is that PI policies aren't generally there to cover personal injury or bodily injury claims. Those claims will generally be covered under a separate public liability policy if it's someone who is an employee, or if it's an employee, those claims will generally be covered under an employer's liability policy. But there's an exception to this where if the injury arises from the negligent performance of the professional services. So for that reason, whilst most professional indemnity policies do contain a specific exclusion regarding bodily injury claims, this is generally subject to a significant write back in circumstances where the claims arise from negligent performances of professional services by an insured.
Okay, so cover is excluded, but then written back, and again the key is negligence. We are now at the final exclusion that we're going to look at today, which is where there are multiple policies in place which overlap. Andrew, what's the position here?
Thanks, Adele. So yeah, in a complex construction project, the same party may be insured under several different policies, and actually those policies can sometimes overlap in terms of the cover available. For example, an insured may have an annual PI policy, but on a particularly big construction project, they might enter into project-specific insurance, which Aaron briefly mentioned earlier. And most insurance policies tend to include an exclusion to cover off that sort of eventuality. And generally speaking, when that exclusion applies, any payments will be pro-rated between the relevant insurers. So in terms of a simple example, if there are two insurance policies with largely the same cover, the claim will be split 50-50 between the relevant insurers. But I'm quite conscious that's probably a lot more simplistic and straightforward than what would happen in the market in reality.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So let's move on to look at a hypothetical case study and see how some of these exclusions might actually work in practice. The case study that we're looking at involves a project to build a block of residential flats. The designs were prepared in 2018. Work began on site in 2019, and that's when things began to go wrong. So in mid-2019, one of the building inspectors who was visiting the site was injured when a beam, which wasn't strong enough, fell on him. The cause was the engineer's calculations, which were wrong. Then in early 2020, it became clear that the costs of the project were going to outweigh the tender price submitted. And this was partly due to the fact that the steel work had to be reinforced because the beams weren't strong enough, and also partly because the contractor had himself underpriced the job. Practical completion was in 2021, but within weeks of this, the residents start to complain of electrical failures throughout the building. There was some investigation, and it turned out that the services engineer had not properly designed the electrical services. So we know about the insurance policy that the contractor's PI cover contains a retroactive date of the 1st of November 2018. We also know that the services engineer was a named insured on the policy. And we can also assume that for the purposes of this case study, that the claims were all made in 2021, and you can ignore things like potential circumstances and things like that arising earlier. So, number one, let's consider the injured building inspector first. He's likely to bring a claim for his injuries, and we have a poll which is anonymous. And the question is, do we think that the engineer's claim is likely to be covered? Please could everyone vote? We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then we can discuss the results. Oh, Lizzie, I can't actually see any results here. I don't know if the rest of you guys can.
I can, Adele. So I can tell you what the final results are.
That was good. Are people still voting?
We've got 63% so far. So I'll give people a few more seconds, see if they want to chime in. No, I think that's it. I think that's it, everyone. Oh no, we've got a few more.
What are people going for? Is it covered?
I don't know if you can see them, but basically we have a split, fairly even split. So 45% of people think that this is likely to be covered, and 55% think it's not.
Okay. Well, Aaron, in your view, as soon as you can see our results, is the building inspector's claim likely to be covered by the contractor's PI policy?
So the answer is it probably will be. So although we discussed earlier that the contractor's PI policy will contain a bodily injury exclusion, the concern here is that the building inspector looks to have been injured as a result of negligent design, and emphasis on negligence. So although the building inspector's claim strictly will be excluded, cover is going to be written back under the policy due to the injury resulting from the contractor's negligence.
Right. So let's move on to our second example. We're going to have a look at the increased costs of the project. Just to remind you all, the costs have increased partly because the calculations for the beams were wrong, and partly because the contractor got his pricing wrong. Again, we have another poll, and the question is, which of these potential exclusions that you can see on your screen now and principles might actually apply in this scenario? Again, we'll give you a couple of minutes. Andrew, I don't know if you can see the results on your screen, so perhaps you could help us out with that as people are voting.
Yeah, I can see them. They're slowly coming through now. It's just a question of getting them to stop. I think we've still got a few more people voting, which is great. I'll give everyone a little while longer. So I think Adele, we've got a pretty even split. So we've got 42% saying option A, pricing risk and retroactive date. 43%, these percentages have changed. They might not add up to 100 now, I'm conscious. The pricing risk, insured versus insured, is now 43. The first one's 41. And then the final one, contractual liability or other insurance, 16%. So most people have said pricing risk and the insured versus insured exclusions.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously, Andrew, you were talking about pricing risks earlier. Can you just run us through which exclusions and principles might be relevant in the context of this question, please?
I can, yeah, thanks. So firstly, well, I think there are two issues that we need to have a think about. And the first one is that we know increased costs have been incurred partly due to the fact that the beams were not strong enough in the example that you ran through. So any increased costs which have not been incurred as a result of that failure might be caught by my pricing risk point from earlier. And secondly, any claim against the contractor in relation to negligent designs or calculations may be affected by the retroactive date, which in our example is obviously the 1st of November 18. So if the designs were the sort of cause of these remedial works being necessary, and those designs were produced and submitted prior to the 1st of November 18, then the claim would not be covered. And it will then be a case of the contractor having to fund the defence costs of the claim itself.
Okay, thank you. So lastly, we have the electrical failures in the building. We know these are caused by defective design by a named insured under the policy. And again, we have a poll of 3 options of potential exclusions that might apply. Please, can you vote again for which exclusion you think could be applicable in the circumstances? And Aaron, perhaps if you could just help us as these results go through.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Well, they're coming in thick and fast on this one. People obviously becoming more confident as the polls go on.
Strong views on this one.
So I think.
So we signposted this one quite a bit, didn't we?
A little, yeah. So we've got 56% of people voting. So excellent. I think that's probably enough to be going on with. And the results are, so 75% of people have put that there's an insured, the insured situation. 23% for contractual liability and 2% for pricing risk. And I'm pleased to say that 75% are right. There's a potential the insured situation here. Whilst a claim by the residents and or management company against the main contractor will be covered, if the main contractor chooses to bring a claim against the separate services contractor responsible for the design defect, and then that's not going to be covered because the main contractor and the services contractor are both named insured under the same policy. So in the circumstances, this shouldn't be too much of a problem though, because any claim against the main contractor will be covered. So the main contractor shouldn't lose out.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's all that we have time for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We've looked at some of the key exclusions in PI insurance, which is relevant to construction contractors. If you've got any questions about this, or if you want to get in touch with us, then our contact details are on the next slide, which should be, which has just come up. Please do complete the feedback form, which will be on your screens when you log off, including, it would be good to have some information on the part about how you'd like to present us to present these sessions going forwards. So whether you'd like us to do it in person or whether you enjoy joining them online. Our next session is on the 14th of July, and you'll get an email after this session setting up details of it. So thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.